Thank you. Really, Applejack, I said, curling against the sofa's shoulder rest and basking in the glow of the hearth. For everything. I wish I could repay you. My home is your home. She merely shrugged. Relax, rest up, and you get better. Later on, we can see about helping you find a place, you reckon? I let loose the tiniest of giggles. Sure, I reckon. I smiled, letting the gray sleeves of the hoodie dangle toastily over the ends of my front hooves. When I was young, I used to envy Twilight Sparkle, wishing that I too had an older sibling to look after me while my parents were away. I wondered if this was what it felt like. Though I don't know if any place in the world has a fireplace as good as this one. Oh, it's a good un, Applejack said with a nod. My pa built it. Always make sure that you lay down a good foundation, he'd say. The rest just takes time. But it works without a hitch so long as the foundation is solid. She gazed briefly into the fire. She looked a lot older suddenly, though she carried it with a far greater strength than the frail melancholy that I see in most ponies. I reckon I've held a lot of weight in them words of his. Pa was my foundation in life. I was floating dizzily on a cloud of warmth, but I was still able to understand the gravity of my new friend's words. I'm sure you've done him proud, I said. I can only make him prouder. Her green eyes twinkled briefly as she smiled, then she trotted past me. I'll see how Granny's doing with the soup. I'll be back in a jiffy. Yeah, okay. I adjusted where I sat on the sofa. Sparks danced against the fire guard before me. I stared into the flame, allowing thoughts of my recent circumstances to melt away. I pulled the hood of the sweater jacket over my horn and exhaled deeply, as if giving up a somber part of myself that had controlled my frightened limbs for so many nocturnal hours of despair. It was the first chance I had to sit and think deeply in days. As a result, something dark and mysterious rose to the surface of my mind. Something that had danced around the miserable waves I had so pitifully navigated up until that point. The more I meditated, the more my ears twitched, for I realized that I was unearthing a melody from the deepest part of my psyche, an undying tune that had been born in the recesses of my mind and remained unsung since the very moment I woke fitfully in a dark alley, a scared and freezing victim of endless night. So engrossed was I in these ponderings I barely noticed a yellow shape trotting up to my peripheral vision, then gasping. I glanced over. There was a small filly looking up at me with wide, amber eyes. A red bow swayed in her crimson mane. Was she shivering? Was she also cold? No, that wasn't it. She was afraid of me. Why, hello there, I said, in as gentle and harmless a voice as I could muster. I smiled at her and leaned over slightly. You must be Applejack's sister. The girl trotted from me, her eyes wide as saucers. Her jaw dropped as a pale sheen danced across her irises, like moonlight rippling over pond water. AJ? Hey, it's okay, I smirked. I'm guessing your sis neglected to mention that you had company. What is it, Applebloom? A familiar orange shape strolled back into the chamber, then immediately froze. My heart jolted, for Applejack was suddenly shouting. Applebloom, get over here now! Panting, the little foal scampered over to her sister. I watched, blinking in confusion, as Applebloom hid behind the mare. Applejack stood protectively in front of her, while glaring down at me on the sofa. All of the sweetness and hospitality was gone, shattered to bits beneath an accusing frown as hard as diamonds. Just who in the hay are you? What are you doing in our house? What? I gasped. My heart was beating hard, as if it would tear a hole in the hoodie at any moment. But I thought that... And is that my jacket you're wearing? Applejack exclaimed, her emerald eyes squinting harshly. I could hear Applebloom's whispering voice as she cowered and hid her face. Behind both sisters, an old green-coated mare strolled up from the other room, curious about the commotion. Have you been rummaging through our stuff? Applejack continued, almost sneering. Spit it out! Applejack, I'm... You know my name? Applejack cocked her head to one side. Her anger was briefly drowned in confusion, but soon that cloud faded and the scorn returned. Did some pony put you up to this? If so, 'tain't funny. We already had a bunch of rambunctious colts vandalizing our barn a few months ago. This farm doesn't need any more mayhem on its plate. Now are you going to answer me or not? I don't understand. I'm Lyra, remember? We were just... I halted mid-speech. My heart briefly stopped, and I felt the warmth of the living room once again dissolving. The next breath from my mouth was a whimper, for I had been reacquainted with my own foolishness. No, dear Celestia, it's happening again. What's happening again? Dang it, Missy, I demand to know why you're trespassing in my very home. Look, I stood up from the couch, weak, legs wobbling. I gulped and backed away from them, waving a hoof. I don't even know how to explain this. Try me. Applejack's iron frown carried her icily toward me. The fire bathed every hard line of her features, but none of the freckles. We were talking just a moment ago, Applejack. You carried me from the edge of town and... Carried you where? I've never seen you before in my life. I know that you must think that, but I swear to you. I gulped before stammering like a fibbing foal who is desperate to avoid the paddle. We talked. You lit the fireplace for me. You gave me this jacket. Likely story. You reckon I'm stupid? No. For the love of Luna, it's not what you... I stopped in place. The shivers had quadrupled. I felt my bones turning to ice. My gaze swam dizzily over the family portraits lining the living room. I saw nothing but the faces of strangers like these three souls gathered before me were and always would be. I grimaced as though I was giving birth to a familiar horror. I'm sorry. I have to go. Oh, no, you don't. I spun and galloped desperately toward the far end of the house. I'm sorry. Applejack? The old mare's voice started. She's getting away! Oh, no, she ain't. Mackie? Their shouting voices dwindled as I shot around a corner and bolted for the front door. Instead, I bumped into something large and red. I fell down on my haunches, reeling sickly. Looking up, I gasped. A tall stallion towered above me, his crimson coat rippling with the sea of iron muscles. On any other occasion, he would have been an impressive sight to behold. At that moment, however, he was menacing as a leering minotaur. Big Macintosh! I heard the elder mare's voice calling over the bounding hoofsteps of Applejack from the chamber behind me. Grab her before she gets away! I gritted my teeth, flashing a look left and then right. I saw a bathroom within a leap's distance. Just as the red brute lunged at me, I bounded out of his reach and bolted toward the doorframe. The doorknob was already glowing from telekinesis by the time I flung myself inside and magically slammed it shut. The house was rumbling from all of the bodies thundering after my hooves. I slipped on a rug, nearly fell, and scampered back on all fours in time to lock the door and press my weight up against it. The door pounded once, twice. I shrieked and pressed myself desperately against it, trembling, my starved body and glittering magic acting as a frail bulwark against the entire family's righteous anger. Oh, Celestia, please. I started weeping, my tears gathering at the collar of the gray hoodie that had been donated to me by a ghost. The door pounded a third time, and I nearly fell back, struggling to keep my hooves firm against the slippery tile. Open this door, I heard Applejack say. I swear we ain't gonna hurt you, girl, but consarn it, you've got some explaining to do. I heard the muttering of the other family members just outside. Y'all can get carted off to jail for invading some pony's home like that. Please, just leave me alone. I sobbed, on the edge of hyperventilating. I murmured into the wooden surface of the door. The police will not do anything, trust me. No pony can do anything for me. Oh, blessed Luna. I hiccuped and slid down against the door, grasping my head and shaking. The tune was louder this time, as if it was wanting to burst out of my skull and bathe the walls of the bathroom with what was left of my soul. I just want some pony to help me, like you almost did. Is that so hard to ask for? There was no response from the other side. I sat there, sniffling, hugging my lower limbs and trembling for what had to have been a full minute. 2, 3. I blinked, dried my eyes with a stone-gray sleeve, and then glanced up. Hello? Again there was no reply. Miss Applejack? Applebloom? I gulped. Mackie? Silence. Pensively, I stood up. I stared at the doorknob for ages before finally summoning the strength to unlock it. Pushing the glowing door open, I peered my head out into the hallway. There was no pony to be seen. I calmed my panting breaths long enough to sneak down the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath me. With a wince, I inched my way until I reached the edge of the living room where the entire debacle had started. I gazed quietly around the corner. Applejack stood before the hearth, her flanks to me. "This seems like an awful waste of wood in the middle of summer." She lowered her hat and scratched her blonde mane while gazing into the crackling fireplace. "Whose idea was this? Apple Bloom?" "It wasn't me, sis." The little yellow foal trotted past her. "Besides, I'm not allowed to put logs in the fire without yours or Big Mac's permission. Ain't that what you're always telling me?" "As much as I fancy you being all obedient like, there's times when I wonder—" "Hey, what's that supposed to mean?" "Don't get yourself in a hissy fit over it, girls." The elder mare sat her green, wrinkly self down in a rocking chair and smiled, basking in the warmth of the fireplace. "After all, this is just what the old doctor ordered for my bones. Apple Bloom, be a dear and go grab Granny's quilt. There's a good little filly." "I reckon I better go help Big Mac with the chores," Applejack muttered as she shuffled toward the back door of the house. "Heavens to Betsy!" She smiled and shook her head as she walked into the reddening sunset. "Where does all the time go? I must be getting old." "No, shut your trap, you stinking baby!" Apple Bloom giggled as she dragged the quilt over to her grandmother. In the background, Applejack rolled a pair of green eyes and was gone. Biting my lip, I stepped back away from the scene. I stood breathless in the hallway, alone with my shivers. I glanced briefly at my reflection in a circular mirror hanging across the wall. A sad, unkempt, dirt-stained unicorn gazed back. Raising a hoof up, I played with the hood dangling around my neck. It was then that I realized the extent to which I could afford friendship in this life. My stomach gurgled again. I glanced longingly at the house's exit, but it stretched away magically before my vision, as did the guilt over what I was about to do. In a blur, I galloped over to the family's kitchen. I flung open the first cupboard that I could find. I discovered 2 loaves of bread and immediately flung them into the front pouch of my hoodie. There were many other things inside that kitchen, expensive and luscious trinkets that could have sold for many bits around downtown Ponyville, but I didn't bother touching a single one of them. It was my first robbery. It might as well have been a tiny one. I prayed to Celestia that it would be my last and ran out of the farmhouse in a desperate flight to reunite with my lyre, as if it was the only thing that could tell me what home was anymore.